understand that how that fits into the big picture. We talked a lot about purpose, right? Author, audience, and purpose. Know who wrote it, know who they wrote it to, and why they wrote it. And if you at least know that about the book when you're sitting down to study it, it'll help you a little bit in understanding what the book is supposed to mean to us today. I heard somebody say a long time ago, if you can't understand what it means to us today without first understanding what it meant to them when it was being written. So last week we looked at Exodus 3 and 4 and talked about that narrative passage there, which is, of course, Moses and the burning bush. And I don't really think we finished through all of my sort of notes and observations from it. And I wanted to just open it up to you guys if there was any other thoughts, questions, comments, or maybe even complaints, quandaries, things about that passage before we moved on to Exodus 20. We talked about the burning bush last time. Okay, well, good. Sorry. I'll let y'all know, I had a very wise mentor of mine tell me one time, never apologize for your preaching. Prepare the best and just let it stand on its own. But sometime between last night and this morning, my allergies and what I thought was just a cough turned into something pretty rough. So I'm going to try and not just cough directly into everybody's ear holes through the mic. But if you can't hear me at times, that's because I'm trying not to just blow out the speakers. So just bear with me. We'll struggle through it. We'll be all right. So, narrative versus the law. Narrative, as the name sounds like, is kind of just a fancier way of saying almost that it tells a story. That is not to say that it's not true. Of course it's true, but it's a story that has a purpose. It's a true story. I think at one point I said it's a historical story with a theological purpose. So it tells us a little bit about God's people, but it does so to reveal something about God. We know all those passages in here about the Israelites, about Moses, about the bush, about the Ten Commandments, about the golden calves. They're really not about God's people as much as they are revealing to us something about God. And so we just observed when we were studying Exodus 3 and 4 that it's easy to follow. We talked about how when you look at these passages in the Old Testament, you kind of need to break them up into larger chunks than you do the New Testament. New Testament, you can get a parable of Jesus in about 6 verses. Whereas, for example, that passage we looked at in Exodus really runs from Exodus 3 to about halfway through chapter 4. So you got to deal with large chunks of text when you're studying the Old Testament. And so what we're trying to do is just compare these narrative texts that tell us these stories about what Moses is doing to some of these texts of the law. And I figured what passage about the law better to study than Exodus chapter 20. What happens in Exodus chapter 20? Thank you. That was really just a see who's awake question. The answer was Michael. Okay, we'll try again. We'll try one again later. So, one of the easier passages of the law. If you know any passage of the law in the Old Testament, hopefully you at least generally know these. I'm not saying you got to be able to list all of them, but hopefully when you see them, your brain at least goes, oh yes, this is a passage about the Ten Commandments. So the problem, I would say the struggle with law texts is we know that we obey some of these laws. Raise your hand if you've committed murder recently, right? Stealing, adultery, bearing false witness, coveting, all things we would say we do not do. But of course, if I flipped over a few pages and I found that, Exodus 29 or somewhere in there, it says not to boil a goat in its mother's milk. When was the last time you read Exodus or Leviticus when preparing your goats and your milk? Probably not in a while. And so the question is, so why do we obey some of these laws and not others? Why do we pick up some of these laws and not others? Well, I've heard a couple different ways of trying to dice that. And you know what? Actually, I'll throw this out for discussion just to see. Have you guys, who has asked that question before? Why do we follow some of these laws and not others? Only a few people have ever asked that question. You're a much less curious crowd than I am, I suppose. But it's okay. What are some answers you've been given when you've asked that question? Just out of curiosity. I just want to see where people are at in terms of understanding the Old Testament, understanding the law.
Well, some people will say it's like, we're not going to follow the law, we're not going to do the law. So if we have things written to do all the law, if not, then
Okay. I might debate you just a little bit and be nitpicky about terminology, but I would say that's largely a decent answer. What else?
And people said, like, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, and all do that.
Right. And so very notably, yes, of the Ten Commandments, Jesus talks about all of them, which, kind of to Michael's point, if we obey the teachings of Jesus, which we certainly do, he talks about all of them except that one. And so that is kind of an interesting point. Has anyone ever heard of the categorization of like moral and ceremonial laws and things like that? If you had, I was going to talk about it. If not, I'm not just going to confuse you, because all I was going to say about it is it's not good. Don't try and use that approach. It's not helpful. It's very arbitrary. Essentially, some people go through and they say, well, these are moral laws and these are ceremonial laws, which is sort of helpful until you realize that you're relying entirely on the person telling you which is which on how to read the Bible. So that's not really not all that helpful. So I would say, well, you know what? First, I want us to read a couple passages on what the rest of the Bible says about the law. I wanted to read a few verses. Someone read for us Psalm 119:18. Psalm 119, verse 18. So I didn't want to be here all morning, but Psalm 119, very famously the longest chapter in the Bible, probably about 3 or 4 pages, depending on what kind of Bible you have. Almost every line about Psalm 119 is about the law. At least every paragraph in some way or another talks about the law. He says, how beautiful are your words. It's where we find that your words are a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. And David goes on and on and on about the law, which is kind of interesting because we might say some of those things about the Gospels or the New Testament or certainly the Bible in general, but none of us would ever say, Leviticus and Exodus, you are a light unto my feet, and how beautiful your words are to me. We just wouldn't really say that. We don't think about it that way. But it's important to realize that they did. This was very serious. They took this very seriously. It was very important. Okay, so that's Psalm 119. Someone read for us Acts 13 through 39. I'm sorry, Acts 13, verse 39. Acts 13, 39.
And by him everyone who believes is justified from all things from which you could not be justified by the law of Moses.
So, David tells us the law is beautiful. It's a light unto our path. We see here, I can't remember off the top of my head who is speaking in Acts 13. I believe it's Paul. But he says, well, something was done through Jesus that the law could not do. So there's an important distinction being made here. Okay? How about Romans 10:4? Romans 10:4. I'm sorry, could you read that one more time? I think I just coughed right over you. I didn't hear a word you said.
For Christ is the end of the law, for righteousness to everyone who believes.
Yes, okay, so Christ is the end of the law. I think I want to read one more before I talk about that, but I want you to think about that, the end of the law, or the purpose of the law. We'll look at least one more here. Galatians 3, verse 23 through 25. Galatians chapter 3, verse 23 through 25. Thank you, Billy. So that's that famous, the law as a school teacher, as a tutor, as a guider passage from Galatians 3. So we know, and we've talked about, how the purpose of, say, for example, Leviticus was to lay out clean and unclean living. But what I want us to understand is at least two things. And that is, number one, that the law is very tied to the covenant. We might look at this later. I want to at least talk about Exodus 21 a little bit. But a little bit later, we'll look at Exodus 23. And we'll read about the covenant that people make with God. And a covenant, as we've talked about, is just a contract. It's a very serious contract or a very serious promise. But the covenant is specific to the people who are involved in it, right? If you go buy a house and you sign a contract, someone else cannot later come along and say, hey, I'm also a part of this contract. I also bought this house. That would not make any sense. Well, this law is tied to this promise that God makes with these people, and it is specific to the people. It is specific to the promised land that he talks frequently about. Everything almost seems to go back to that. So it's tied to the people and tied to the land because of that contract and that covenant. And so it's specific to them. But the other thing I want you to recognize, and this is what we're really going to talk about in terms of understanding the law, is this idea of the end of the law or the purpose of the law. You remember if I told you to tell me one thing Jesus said about the law, does anyone know where I'd be going with that? First thing that comes, is there something that comes to your mind that Jesus says, I came to fulfill it, not to abolish or to destroy the law. And so, which is why Michael, to I guess go full circle, while I could probably have some nitpicky debates about the terminology between old law and new law, I would say that perspective is largely true, that we are obedient to Christ, not because he has destroyed the old law, but because he has fulfilled it. So I want to talk about fulfilling it for a moment here. And I'm doing all this because while I agree we are obedient to the new law, as we might want to call it, or we want to say just the new teachings through Jesus, the covenant through Jesus, the covenant of promise, the covenant of faith, these are all words and phrases the New Testament uses to talk about our salvation through obedience to Jesus Christ. I don't want us to think that our Bibles start at Matthew. And I feel like sometimes that perspective of old versus new can almost create this idea that, well, nothing before Matthew matters. And that's really not true, for a number of reasons. But when I say fulfill, and I think the literal word there is like to fill up to the fullest extent, or to make complete to the fullest extent. Yeah, no kidding, right? Especially today. There's almost this idea in the Hebrew language of a cup that has been filled completely to the brim, or even to the point of running over, which means, just like a cup, the law existed for a purpose. It existed for a specific reason, and that when Jesus came, he fulfilled that reason. And I've heard several different analogies about the law and things like that. One of them is that, if you're filing your taxes, you file your taxes according to the most recent code, right? We all filed our taxes according to the 2022 fiscal year tax code. We don't file our taxes according to the 1990 or the 1980 tax code, though those existed for those times. We file them by the most recent one. And this kind of works, but over and over, Scripture just tells us how important that passage that I'm saying, if I just said, we don't just disregard that's not important to us at all, well, then I have to do something with Psalm 119. I have to do something with Galatians 3:23, where they talk about the importance of these old texts. So even though the law is tied to the land, the law is tied to the people, and when Jesus came, he fulfilled the purpose of that law. For us to understand what Jesus did, we have to understand what he's doing. Boy, that sentence made a lot more sense in my head. Let me try again. If Jesus is saying, I came to fulfill the law, and we don't know what the law is, how can you tell me what Jesus did? How can you tell me what Jesus did or what his purpose was on earth when he says, well, I came to fulfill the law, not to destroy it, if we don't know the law? Or if we at least don't know its purpose. And so I want us to understand that when Leviticus tells the people not to boil a goat in its mother's milk, or that if you own a slave, you can whip them this many times, but not this many, and you can sell them for this, but not for this. The purpose of the law is not simply obedience to the law, but it's actually to create in the Israelites a people who are closer to God. If you remember when we studied Exodus 3, and God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, he said, I will free my people. Do you remember why he said he was going to free them from Egyptian captivity? He said, so that you can worship me on this mountain. That's kind of odd. We know the story of the burning bush. We know the story of the Exodus and the being set free from Egyptian slavery. But do you realize that when God appears to Moses, he says, I'm setting you free for the purpose that you can come up here and worship me the way that I want, the way that I desire for you to be. And something we see throughout the Old Testament and even really the New is that to be in the presence of God and to worship God the way that God desires to be worshipped, you have to be a certain kind of way. Right? You've got to be clean, is the word used over and over in the Old Testament, but you've got to be spotless as snow, white as snow, blemishless before him, without blemish before him. And that is true cover to cover in the Bible. That to be in the presence of God, you have to be holy, or else that's when you start seeing people's face melt and their eyes come out and they start getting struck down. And so God says if his purpose is to bring up a people out of slavery and bring him into this holy relationship with him, he's telling them, hey, there's some stuff you got to do to become holy with me. There's some stuff you need to do to become right and to appear before me in a manner that is acceptable. Because again, we talk about just how God is holy and he's above all things and he's more holy than anything we can imagine. Over and over we see when people approach God when they're not supposed to, it does not end well for them. When people go behind the curtain when they're not supposed to, and people touch the Ark of the Covenant and they're not supposed to, that does not end well for those people. And it's because we are not clean, God is, and we must become clean to approach him. So those people had to rid their sin, they had to become clean, we would say, so that they could approach and worship God in a manner that was pleasing to him. And we have to actually do the same thing, believe it or not. But we are not made clean by the sacrifices of goats, or the sacrifices of sheep, or the giving of rams, or the horn and the anointing of oil. We are made clean through the blood of Christ. So the purpose of the law, the purpose as to why the law exists for the Israelites is still true for us. We still exist to worship and glorify God. God still wants us to be holy and blameless before him when we worship him and how we worship him. But the manner in which we get there is different. Does that make sense? So we have to kind of understand this purpose of the law, even if we don't follow it. And it might sound like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth on that, but questions, thoughts, comments. Am I making sense? Yes, sir. Yes, I would agree with what you're saying there. And just for the mic up audio, I'll clarify a bit. You make an important distinction that I think I probably could have looked at. Hebrews talks a little bit about. Galatians hinted at this, or maybe it was Acts 13:39 that said Jesus did what the law could not fully do. And that was, I've heard the terminology of, the sacrifices and the repeated coming to God rolled back their sin, but it really could not forgive sin. It could not justify them in the way that Jesus could. And so, yes, that's an important distinction. That part of that fulfillment is that Jesus did what the law alone could not do. Absolutely. Yes, sir. Absolutely. I would 100% agree. We cannot fully understand. And I mean, it's like I said before, the New Testament was not written and then the Old Testament brought up later as a prologue. Just so, hey, here's some other information that might be useful. It's very important to understand how we got from there to here. So we looked at those passages. The law was not timeless. Even then it was not timeless. It was never eternal. It was never forever. But God's nature is unchanging. And so we must still approach him in the right way, even if we are not obedient, per se, to the law. So when you ask this question, why do we obey some laws and why do we not obey others? I would say we obey others, and Kenny, you kind of hinted at this when you were talking about the Sabbath. We obey others when they are in the teachings that we do follow. I don't not murder somebody because the Ten Commandments tell me not to, or I don't not covet because the Ten Commandments tell me not to. But I don't do that because Jesus tells us not to do that. He tells us, and in fact, he actually tells us to do much harder things than just those 10 commandments. He says, don't just not murder, but don't even be angry. Don't just not commit adultery, but don't even be lustful. Why? Because he's trying to get them to understand that obedience to the law is not the end to itself. You need to obey the law, but the end is holiness before God. And if I'm going to be holy before God, I've got to do a lot more than just obey a few laws. So, okay. So, all that being said, when we sit down to study a passage, like say Exodus 20, which really runs through, Exodus 23, about all these laws, we have to understand our context. We have to understand what the purpose of the text is. We have to understand why they're important, who they're important to. We'll read just a few verses. I was trying to decide where in here I wanted to go, but we'll stick with we'll pick out a few verses. Someone read for us Exodus 20, verse 12 through verse 17. Exodus 20, verse 12 through verse 17. Actually, I'm gonna pause you right there. Turn myself off on accident. That right there, and I didn't even really intend for this to work out the way it did. Do you see how even that is specific to the people and specific to the land? He says, honor your father and mother. Why? So that your days may be long in the land which your God is giving to you. So again, covenant, very tied to the people, very tied to the land. If we are not Israelite people who are living in the promised land, that should at least raise some flags to us that this probably does not apply, at least not in the way that we would think it would. But anyway, keep reading for us.
You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor.
So, we've talked about this. I'm afraid I'm going in circles, but I want to make sure we're at least clear on it. Do I do all the things that those verses he just read tell me to do? If I'm a Christian, do I still do all those things? Yes. Do I do them because they're in Exodus 20? No. That's not my covenant. That's not my contract. Those are not the terms and conditions I agreed to. But recognize I actually agreed to much harsher terms and conditions. I agreed to terms such as be holy, therefore I am holy. Not just obeying your father and mother, but loving your enemies, praying for those who persecute you, things like that. So, not just not bearing false witness, but if so, live peaceably with all men. I guess just questions, because like I said, I'm afraid it's about as clear as mud, but I also don't want to just sit here and do this. Questions, comments, thoughts? You guys always make me nervous when nobody has any questions, because I'm like, okay, either no one understands a thing I'm saying, or by some miracle of God, everything makes perfect sense. You guys have no questions. What was the purpose of the law? We'll start there. Just so we're clear on this before we move on to our next sort of section here. Purpose of the law. To keep the people holy before God. I'll go for one more analogy, and hopefully this will maybe clear it up a little bit. When a parent tells their child not to touch the stove when they're cooking, what is their plan there? From hurting themselves. They want the child to grow up and be a successful adult. When you pick out your clothes for your kids in the morning, I don't know what age you have to stop doing that. I guess I'll figure that out. But when you have to pick out the clothes for your kids in the morning, is your goal for them to wear that shirt and those pants on every, say, Sunday morning? No. At some point, you expect them to start picking out clothes for themselves, although you still expect them to look nice, or you expect them to be clean, and maybe not wrinkled, and hopefully match, or at least not clash. I don't know what matching looks like. My standards just don't clash, Don't have 2 shades of orange on or something like that. But you have sort of rules and things that you do that your goal is not just for them to obey the things that you're telling them to do, but your goal is actually for them to grow and mature and learn to do those things, even though you're not standing over their shoulder telling them that all the time. And I'm telling you, the more we can see God's relationship with his people as this relationship between a parent and child that grows and matures over time, things will click that maybe wouldn't otherwise. Over and over, God gives them the law, and then people disobey him in ways that's like, okay, I didn't really, like if we think about the example of Cain and Abel, I almost feel like I can see God saying, okay, I guess I didn't realize I had to tell you, yeah, don't murder your brother. Don't murder people. Don't do that just because you're unhappy, just because sin is crouching at the door. Things go on. He says, okay, don't do. The more they grow and they start almost sort of figuring things out, God is giving them more and more rules because he's saying, I don't want you to live this way. I want you to live this way. But the end goal is not for them to wake up every morning and check off a list of things that God tells them to do. The end goal is for them to become people who are successful adults, we might say, who obey and worship God because that's the kind of people they are. In the same way that a parent, they want their kid to become successful, independent adults, not just because they do what you say 24/7, although you'd probably like that, but because they on their own have become somebody who is independent, who is successful, who is obedient. Does that make sense? Okay. Get a little more head nods there, so hopefully that makes sense. I was debating, I wanted to finish this the narrative and law thing last week, and I was debating whether I wanted to start a whole new section this week. And so I was kind of not sure how quickly we would get through all this. So Exodus 3:12, by the way, is the passage where God says he brings them out of slavery to worship them on the mountain. The other verse I would have read earlier was Hebrews 8:13 is what I was thinking of, where he says, by speaking of a new covenant, he has made the old pass away. And so we have to understand that our covenant is through Christ. And when we are obedient to the law, it is not for the sake of obeying the law itself, but because it brings us in a right relationship with God. So, again, last chance for questions, comments, thoughts on the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. All right, well, cool. Well, we only got about 10, 15 minutes left, but we'll go ahead and start our new section here. This next section of the Bible, if you remember I meant to pull our slides up this morning, but I have failed you. But our next section, we kind of call the historical books Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We call them the historical books because they tell us sort of the history of God's people. But I would argue that really can lead us to a misconception about what these books are. They are historical truths, but do not expect Joshua to tell you everything that happens under Joshua's leadership as the people of God. I made this comparison before, that imagine if I had two books, and one is I say, this is a history of the Civil War. This is a history of the Civil War. Then I hand you another book that says, this is what happened to my family during the Civil War. Those are two very different books. You expect this to cover a lot of stuff and just be filled with random facts and events that happened, maybe some historical commentary on those events. But if I hand you this book, you know that I am telling you not just my version, but I'm telling you what happened to me. I don't care what happened to my neighbor Joe. I don't care what happened to the people over there. I'm telling you this is what happened to us. And I want us to think about Joshua through really 2nd Kings at least, if not 1st and 2nd Chronicles as well, as really this second book. We call them the historical books. The Jews actually just called them the earlier prophets. The Jews just called them the earlier prophets and the later prophets because they believed they were speaking the word of God, but they were also telling what happened to them. And so again, when we talk about reading this and understanding the purpose of it, at no point does God sit down and say, you know what, I think you need to know everything that has ever happened to my people. He doesn't do that. But he says, I'm going to tell you some stories because I think they'll be helpful to you. I'm going to tell you some of the things that happened to our people because I think you can learn from these. I mean, the passage we read, these things were written for your instruction, to be the schoolmaster, to be the guidance. And I believe when you study, this becomes evident because how many times can you read these texts that are thousands of years old and you find people behaving the exact same way people behave today? How many times do you see people falling temptation to the same things people fall into temptation about today? I mean, we're in Joshua, so we'll look at the first. I don't know if I'm going to look at reference verses exactly. But if I asked your kids to tell me one thing Joshua did, what would they probably tell me? Or what would you tell me? I tell you guys all the time, I have a VeggieTales knowledge of the Old Testament sometimes. And so the VBS stories are what stick out to me whenever I'm going back and reading it. But if I can tell you one thing Joshua did, it is Joshua and the city of Jericho. I know that story like the back of my hand because I've heard it since I was 6. But you know what happens right after Jericho? Achan and the Battle of Ai. The Battle of Ai, which is the heading in some texts, chapter 8, by the way, Joshua chapter 8 is what we're talking about, could almost better be called the, I'm sorry, you're right, Ben, Achan is what I was thinking of, not Ai. Ai comes afterwards. Right after the destruction of Jericho, we have the defeat at Ai in 7. He redeems them in 8. But we have Ai and Achan. Ai is the place. Achan is the man or the man in his family. But again, put yourself in the shoes of these people. God has just said, I want you to destroy this city by doing a very odd and unusual thing. And they obey him. And their first thought is, hey, maybe we can do everything else by ourselves. Now, on one hand, we're like, that's so foolish. But on the other hand, anybody know anybody in their household that might have sometimes acted like that? Any kids or teenagers that sometimes, the moment they're around the corner, like, no, I got this on my own, Mom. We're good. I just needed you to bail me out of my problems a week ago, but now I've totally got it figured out and I can do this on my own. Yeah. 1,000-year-old problems. People behave the same way. So, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the books of history, or as, like I said, as the Jews called them, the earlier prophets, they fill this gap between Moses and coming out of Egypt and all the way into the era of David and Solomon. And as we get later and later into the Bible, if you have a Bible that has maps at the back, I encourage you to look at them. I'll try and get some for our slides so that we can kind of follow what's happening geographically, because we're going to see that kings and locations and cities and people become very important. And again, this is very difficult for us, I think, sometimes to sit down and read, because if you read the New Testament, the only really people you need to be aware of is like Jesus and maybe 5 other people, right? I can get through 1 Corinthians, Romans, Luke, 2 John. I can get through any of those books in the New Testament if I know like 5 people, Jesus and like 4 other people. If you get into the Old Testament, you kind of need to be able to keep some notes, keep an idea, keep things square in your head, because, again, as we've talked about before, when Paul wrote his letters, he expected people to have the gospel. We know that because the letters were written to the church. The letters were written to the church. The church had to have had knowledge of Jesus if they were Christians. Everything from here on out in the Old Testament assumes a very deep and very firm understanding of those first 5 books we just studied. And I'm willing to bet, if all y'all are like me, you have like an okay understanding of those first 5 books. And so that's why I said I got to take notes, I got to highlight things, I got to write things down, read it a couple times. But that is one of the reasons our Bible is compiled the way that it is because when you get to parts in the middle of the Bible, they expect you to know the things in the beginning of the Bible. But unfortunately, that's not how we read it very often. And so when Joshua starts telling you about these people and the sons of so-and-so and the son of so-and-so and the ancestor of so-and-so, and they were this way because they were descended from these people, he is most of the time, again, from here on out, referencing some of those lists of families that we saw in Exodus, that we saw in Leviticus, that we saw even in Genesis. And sometimes you kind of got to like, okay, and this is where if you have a digital Bible, very helpful. If you come across a name in Joshua and 2 Kings and Samuel that you're like, I've never heard that name before, who is that? Get out a digital Bible, your phone, tablet, computer, go to the local library. They have computers with access to the internet. This is an unknown concept. And just put the name in the search bar. Figure out when the first time the Bible mentions that name. Because more often than not, once you're past about Deuteronomy, they're expecting you to know some of these people. Can you understand it without knowing those people? Sure. But again, if we're sitting down to study and to learn the purpose, you need to kind of understand the context that they're expecting you to have. Again, I think of just any other kind of schooling. If you're in 6th grade, do you think I'm assuming you have knowledge of 5th grade? Yes. Don't know if you guys know, but in the public school system, yes. If you were in 6th grade, they expected you to have passed 5th. If you do not pass 5th, you do not go to 6th grade. Unless I think you fail enough. I think I've heard before that if you fail enough, they just sort of shoo you on and tell you to keep going. But That's a conversation for another time. So, if I'm in Joshua, guess what I expect you to have knowledge of? Everything, but thank you, Jenny. Everything before Joshua. Here's a trick question. If I'm in 2 Samuel, guess what the author of 2 Samuel expects you to know? Okay, cool. Yes, good. All right, I'm glad I'm making sense. You guys worry me sometimes. Good. So, it's why chronological reading of the Bible is helpful, even though it's very hard. It's very hard sometimes to sort of slog through some of these middle passages of the Bible, but it's very helpful because you can start to piece the stories together a little bit better. So, we'll put this back up on the slides next week. Again, I apologize that I don't have them. But if you remember when we were studying the first 5 books of the Bible, we said we need to know 3 things. What are the 3 things? Author. I'll give you a hint. First one was author, purpose, and audience. Who wrote it, who they wrote it to, and why. So, any guesses on who wrote Joshua? Hey, okay, good. That's, again, if you've not had many years in Bible school, if the name of the book is someone's name, it's either who wrote it or who it's to, usually. Sometimes it's tricky. Things like Acts, right? You never really know. But most of the time, if it's named after a person, they either wrote it or that's who it's written to. This is about Joshua, and in case we don't know, the first verse of the first chapter of the book of Joshua says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua. And of course, the first chapter is Joshua's calling. So Joshua picks up really right where Deuteronomy left off. Joshua just tells us what happens to the people under Joshua. It's written by Joshua. The audience is sort of the Israelites, but now, when we were giving the law, and there's an important shift that happens here. When we were giving the law, the audience was explicitly the Israelites, right? God over and over, every single time God speaks to Moses, he says, go and tell the people this. Go and tell the people the Lord says this. Go tell them the Lord says this. As we shift into these later books, here's where we are starting to see these are specifically written for a later audience in mind. And that's different. As we look at it later, we will understand what that means. And we know this because sometimes we have little hints like, well, the Canaanites were in the land at that day. If you ever notice that when you're reading your Bible in some of these books right here, it'll reference these time periods and it'll say, well, at this time, things were this way. And so some of these were written really for a future audience in mind. That's helpful to us because we are a future audience, even if we're not their intended future audience. More on that later. So Joshua is written by Joshua to tell what happened to the people under the leadership of Joshua. And if I could say the purpose of Joshua in one verse, I got to flip there. If I could pick the purpose of the book of Joshua in one verse, it would actually be the first verse of the book of Judges. And here's why. We read Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. Here's Judges chapter 1, verse 1. Now after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? I would say it's either that, or there's another verse in Joshua that I cannot find at this moment. But when Joshua starts, there's a plan when Moses dies. In fact, if you've read Exodus, if you've read Deuteronomy, Joshua actually gets mentioned before the book of Joshua. Isn't that crazy? Remember what we said about understanding prior knowledge? Joshua is brought up under Moses to follow in Moses' footsteps. Moses made an intentional effort to bring up leadership after he died. Joshua did not. And that is really the purpose of Joshua, is really this transition of leadership. Moses not only led the people, but he ensured that there was a plan after he died to lead the next generation of people. How often do we talk about the generational problems when we were looking at Exodus, we were looking at Leviticus and Numbers? How the generation in the wilderness, the generation that disobeyed God, the generation that saw the promised land. Moses took action to ensure there would be leadership in the next generation. Joshua did not. Is anybody familiar with the book of Judges? Not a very good story. A lot of chaos in the period of the Judges compared to the period of Joshua and the period under the kings. Why? Because Joshua did not place leadership after his own for the next generation. Funnily enough, maybe it's coincidence, maybe it was just on my mind, this week, one of our sermon themes for the next few weeks is going to be called The Next Generation. And it's that idea of thinking about what's going to happen in the next generation of Christians. And part of that is because of the contrast that exists between Joshua and Judges. Just as an aside, contrast, especially going forward, we will see that contrast between characters, whether it's David and Saul, David and Solomon, Samuel and David at times. Contrast between characters is a big, big thing going forward. There's not always explicitly good guys and bad guys, but a lot of times characters' actions are displayed in contrast or juxtaposed next to somebody else to say, this is what happens when it's done right, this is what happens when it's done bad. Joshua leads the people well. And the entire book of Joshua really exists in contrast to the book of Judges. We already had the first bell. Did I miss that? Okay, good. Well, and that seems as good as a time to hit a pause at least. Next week, we'll do what we did for the Pentateuch. We'll go book by book, and we'll talk about the author, audience, and purpose of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we'll try to get to 1st and 2nd Kings. So, thank you guys.